thank you all for coming along tonight. This is the best turnout that we've had in this venue since we've had it. I'd like to, in that context, recognise Lynn Brazel, who owns these premises here and who's donated this space to us. So it's a real privilege to be able to use this to bring people in here and to hear people like Peter Reef. I've got a few people that I should acknowledge apart from Peter, and I'll get round to Peter and pull away in a few minutes. I'd like to thank Peter Sherwood, who brought Peter down and is putting him up tonight. And has also offered financial support to Peter's campaign. And Peter's been a very good supporter of our think tank as well. So, Peter. The latest since Hawker, I understand. I'd also like to acknowledge Anthony Capello and Julie, his wife. The Capellos have, how long's Connor Court been going now? 2005. So for 16 years now, they've been doing a sterling job publishing pieces that anyone else would be scared about getting cancelled for these days. But you can't, you can't cancel the fellows, and thank goodness for that. And they're obviously the publisher of this book, and you'll be helping not just Peter, but you'll be helping them when you go and buy not just one copy, because you'll need one for yourself, but another copy to give away. There's no point keeping the information in this room. You've got to get out there and spread the story to other people. From the Australian Institute of Progress, I'd like to acknowledge Bob Tucker, who's our chair. And yeah, and Dan Ryan. And I should acknowledge my daughter Sophia down here, who's been handling some of the arrangements. Looking after the audience that hopefully is logged on Zoom. And I should also acknowledge Penny, my partner, who we've got one apology from Jane Prentice, who's also on our board. Now, just an ad for the Australian Institute of Progress. You wonder why you need organisations like ours, but organising the catering for this today made me understand why we need to keep fighting back against central planning. And we've got a really good example here tonight. Generally, what we do is we put out platters of food and we let you all help yourselves. And we know over time basically how much we need. And it all sorts it out. If you don't want to have prosciutto and you want to have salami, that's fine. No one forces it on you. However, because of the minuscule risk that you might catch COVID, we're now subject to central planning. So what do the central planners say? They say, oh no, you can't let people organise things for themselves. You've got to organise it for them. So we've bought all this food, we've packaged it up. We've made different types of platters, but they've got maybe 4, I think, ingredients on them. So it might be that you like the camembert, but you don't like the prosciutto. So maybe some of you are particularly entrepreneurial. I didn't notice a market going on here. You could have been offering to trade, but it's still a very inefficient way of doing it.
There's a cafe on the corner. I think you should do a deal with them.
And I'm pretty sure at the end of the day, we're going to have a lot of food left over when generally we don't. So it's a good example as to how central planning doesn't work and how people looking after themselves does. Yeah. And that's what the Australian Institute of Progress is about, and we apologise for having to put you through the ordeal with the food. However, the wine and beer are on the old system, so feel free to help yourselves afterwards. So, to Peter Reef. I first actually knew Peter's father. John Reed wrote at least one mathematics textbook, so some of us were probably put through hell trying to jump through the hoops in Peter's father's book, but John Rick used to send me articles for online opinion about the quality of education, particularly maths and sciences. And if you're like me and you went through in the 70s, then you're at the peak for maths and science education in Queensland. And it's been going down ever since. And John was in there banging the drum about teaching standards, what people were being taught, how they were being taught, who was teaching it to them. And I thought, this guy's brave. He really puts it out there. And then I met his son. And, you know, you can say, might be nature, it might be nurture, I'm not sure. But Peter certainly is in that mould where he's driven by the facts and he's not scared to stand up to people who want to deny the facts. And he's certainly shown over the last, I guess, about 5 years now that this has been going on with James Cook University. Almost 4 years.
Feels like
that he's not scared to play the role of David. So he's in the High Court in June, I think. So let's hope one of those pebbles in the slingshot meets the temple of James Cook University, and what we think ought to be the ideal of academic freedom is given primacy over what might be in a set of standards or in an employment contract. So Peter's here specifically not to talk about that, but he's happy to take questions. He's here to talk about the facts, which is his book, Reef Heresy. So, Peter?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'll talk overwhelmingly about the book. I'm happy to take questions on those, the legal matters as well. But of course, the sort of stuff that I'm going to talk to you about is essentially what got me into trouble in the first place. It's all related anyway. And so it's about the reef and a bit further than that, how we actually use science and research to make policy and how we're making some terrible mistakes at the moment. So I'll start off with just talking about the reef and where I ultimately want to get to. I've been banging this drum for a long time. Essentially, a lot of the science, the science in inverted commas, which we're using for public policy, is improperly quality assured. And a lot of it, I'm quite sure, is just plain straight wrong. And it's quite remarkable that how little checking goes on with this science. And what I ultimately want is an Office of Science review, so that if I'm going to have a legislation for the farmers, if they're affecting the Great Barrier Reef, that science is actually properly checked. Now, there are plenty of problems with the idea, but ultimately I think we need something of that ilk. All right, so before we go on about the reef, well, the first thing about the reef is that it's a very large system, and the other thing is that large parts of it periodically just get wiped out, right? So it might be a cyclone. Cyclones are by far the biggest. So here's a picture of the reef. You could lose most of the surface coral on half the reef. In fact, in 2011, that's exactly what happened with Cyclone Hamish, right? We lost half the surface coral in the southern part of the reef. Within 6 years, it had almost all grown back. You would have heard about the destruction, you wouldn't have heard about the regrowth. So a lot of the book is about the ways that the reef dies. Crownthorn starfish, you can lose a lot and then it bounces back. But one point about the reef is that most people have no idea about the scope. You know, it's 2,000 kilometres long. Most of it is a long way from the reef. And I won't talk a huge amount about climate change. I'm going to mostly talk about the effect or the supposed effect of farmers on the reef. Most people don't realise that it's about 50 to 100 kilometres from the reef, from the coast, especially if you're down here or if you're in Melbourne or the other side of the world. They don't realise that. And of course, the reef is made up of 3,000 individual reefs, which are just a kilometre or so in size. All right, so I want to talk about the farmers, right, because that's really been one of my motivations for doing so much of this, because they're getting all sorts of legislation which is affecting their profitability, but it's worse than that. I've had a few farmers who've got kids at school who've had their kids come home and they're saying, you know, Dad, we're told that our farm is killing the reef, and it really hurts them. It really hurts them here that they've been told by their kids that they're killing something as precious as the Great Barrier Reef. So they've been told that the mud from the farms washes out to the reef. They've been told the pesticides and the nutrients from the fertiliser. We'll start with mud, because mud was my speciality. So I worked for, we invented the instrumentation to measure mud on the reef for long periods. And my group had more measurements of mud on the reef, sediment concentrations, than all the other groups put together. And essentially, we were able to show that the mud doesn't get out to the reef at all. So you have this classic picture of the reef. Well, where's the mud? There is no mud. You can actually take a sample of that sediment, and it's all calcium carbonate made up and broken up coral, right? Totally different chemical signature to what mud from a farm or from the land is going to have. It just doesn't get out there. So 99% of the coral on the reef looks like that. And there's no possibility that farmers can be affecting it because there is no mud there, full stop. Now, I compare this with, say, the situation with the climate change. There may be some sceptics here about climate change. But at least there is a prima facie case about climate being affected by carbon dioxide, because we are producing carbon dioxide from burning coal, and the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are actually going up, right? There's no doubt about that. You can argue about is that causing a warming in temperature? But at least there is some carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that wasn't there 100 years ago. Well, there is no mud on the reef. So how can it be? There's not even a prima facie case here that the farmers are having any effect on 99% of the reef. Here's a picture of Green Island. It's actually the closest of the main barrier reef reefs to the mainland. It's one of the only ones where you can actually take a picture of the reef and the mainland in the same picture, because usually it's so far away from the coast. There is no mud on Green Island. All right, but you would have seen pictures like this, right? They come out periodically, very rarely, in fact, because this is the Townsville Flood, and you can see the Brisbane River, the biggest river on the Queensland coast in terms of discharge, and there is the reef. That's the closest of all the inshore, of all the reefs to the Brisbane River, and the plume just reaches the reef. Now, it turns out the concentrations of mud in that plume were about 2 milligrams per litre. That means basically stuff all right? There was high concentrations here, but all that sediment drops out of suspension very rapidly. Now, you get these pictures to demonstrate how the effect of farming is killing the reef. But in fact, it shows the opposite. Because when was the previous picture that looked like this? Well, it's 2007, right? So between 2007 and 2019, I guess, no floods that actually reached the reef. And what did this one reach? It reached 2 of the 3,000 reefs for a couple of days, and there was basically stuff all sediment in that plume. If anything proves, again, that the farmers are not affecting it, this is the worst case scenario, and it lasts 2 days out of 10 years, and it really isn't a problem at all. All right, so in terms of the main Great Barrier Reef, there is no effect. But if I come back to my first picture, this is the Barrier Reef. There are some very tiny inshore reefs, right? These are ones that are next to the coast, and that's different. And the scientists will often talk about the inshore Great Barrier Reef is in dire threat from farming. And the inshore Great Barrier Reef sounds like a lot of coral, doesn't it? Right? It sounds like maybe half of it. The inshore reef and the offshore reef, the inshore must be half. No, the inshore reef is maybe 1%. There's a possibility that that's actually affected because the Australian Institute of Marine Science, we've got Senator Rennick here, who was at the Senate inquiry, where we finally, it was like getting blood out of stone, got enough. He actually asked, how much of the reef is the inshore reef? We got them finding it. He said 3%. I think it's less than that, but only half of that 3% is in the area affected by farming. So maybe 1.5% is affected by farming. But even that is an overestimate. Now, this is a picture near Townsville. And that's Magnetic Island over there. And there are fringing reefs around Magnetic Island, just offshore from Townsville. And this is the water, which will be like that today because it's blowing 20 knot southeasterly wind at the moment. And the mud that's on the seabed, it's always been on the seabed for thousands of years, gets stirred up by the waves. And all these reefs around Magnetic Island have grown up over many thousands of years and have adapted to high sediment concentrations, right? The amount of the extra sediment they see from the waves, is 100 times more than what they see from a river plume, right? 100 times more. So even if you double what comes out of the rivers, it's sort of like half of 1% increase in terms of the effect on the reef. Basically, it has no effect on the reef. We were able to demonstrate that over many years. All right, but on the reef itself, where the 99% of the coral, that's what it looks like. It just amazes me how we've managed to convince the world that this wonderful, magnificent thing is on its last legs and it's this polluted wasteland. Just look at it. How can you say that? So, but why is the water so pure? Well, one of the reasons, this is our other work, which I've done with some of my colleagues, is that we talk about these rivers that flow in from the coast that are maybe affecting the reef, but we ignore these massive rivers, the ocean currents that come in from the east, from New Caledonia. This is what's called the New Caledonian Jet. This is the North Vanuatu Jet coming in. They form the East Australia current. And these are monumental currents. They're literally tens to hundreds of thousands of times bigger than the biggest rivers, okay? And they bring in it this wonderful, iridescent blue water. And that is the reason there is no pollution on the Great Barrier Reef. They talk about pesticides from farmers killing the reef, right? You go out there, you can't even measure the pesticide concentrations, even with the most sensitive scientific equipment. It was another thing which we got out of them at the Senate inquiry. And yet farmers now have legislation which affects the fertiliser they put on, the pesticides they put on, and the mud that erodes off their farm. Now, of course, we want to minimise all of these things going on, but we shouldn't be blaming farmers for things which they're not doing. And not just from the economic point of view, but also from their psychological point of view. All right, this is a graph. It's actually one of the first graphs in the book, actually. And it's what I call the Choral Challenge. I've been on at the Australian Institute of Marine Science for a couple of years now, trying to get them to do a very important measurement. So with corals, the great big corals, and Jennifer Marahas has been doing some work with me on this, the corals, as they grow, they lay down a layer of coral, a bit like a tree ring, every year, so they get bigger and bigger. So you can drill a hole in the coral, and you can go literally back 400 years, and you can see the growth rates over the last 400 years, right? And this only goes back to the year 1900 to the year 2005. And Ames originally did this work, and they claim that in fact, it goes back, I'm positive, it goes back to the year 1517, slowly increasing growth rates. So this is growth rate, and then it suddenly collapsed. So Ames claimed the coral's growth rates suddenly started to collapse in the year 1990, right? Now, that's a big deal. Headlines all around the world that the growth rates were collapsing. Now, we looked at this data, and in fact, what had happened was that they took one set of data up to the year 1990, and then they used a different methodology from the data from 1900 to 2005. Very, very naughty from the scientific point of view, and that's what caused this collapse. We reanalyzed the data, and we reckon actually the correct number is up here. But more importantly than that, this was literally a decade ago that I was on about this. For the last 15 years, they have not collected any data of coral growth rates. So the last data we have of coral growth rate ends in 2005. Now, I've been saying to them, look, you might be right. I don't think you are. We might be right, right? The way to determine this is go out again, drill the holes, use the same methodology. The corals are still there. They've still got the data locked up inside them. We can find whether we're going to hell or whether things are okay. Why won't you do that? And they won't do it. They will not do it. They refuse to do this simple measurement, and you've got to ask why. So the fundamental problem there is we have an organisation, and they're not the only one. In fact, they're the best one. They're the best reef organisation. But we have an organisation that is not being scientific. And this is a fundamental problem which we have. And we have a fundamental quality assurance problem right through the environmental sciences, but it even goes further. So what is the main quality assurance system which we use in science? It's called peer review, right? And you take your paper, it goes off to your peers, they review it, and it sounds all great, and people think that this is when a dozen scientists look at this work and they redo the experiments and all the rest of it. That's rubbish, right? Usually peer review is a quick read by a couple of people who may be your mates. It may only last a couple of hours, and they'll say yay or no. Very, very pathetic quality assurance. This guy is the editor of one of the most prestigious medical journals, The Lancet. This is what he said about peer review. We know that the system of peer review is biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, easily fixed, often insulting, usually ignorant, occasionally foolish, and frequently wrong. This is our primary quality assurance system in the whole of science, right? We have a problem, right? Now, for most science, it doesn't necessarily matter. But in the biomedical area, where they've started to really become aware of this, it really does matter because you kill people, right? It doesn't matter if we, put a few cane farmers out of business in 20 years' time. They don't care about that. But here we're going to kill people, right? And this guy, John Ioannidis, has been publishing on this problem. And his most incredible paper, which is titled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." And he can prove statistically that actually this must be the case, at least in the biomedical area. I don't think it's necessarily true in all areas, but certainly true in biomedical area. Sorry? Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Exactly. And he reckons that about 85% of the spending which we do on science is wasted because we're going up blind alleys because the base work was wrong in the first place. When drug companies take a bit of, University of Queensland, they discover some chemical that might be good for curing cancer, a drug company will come along and say, well, it's going to cost us a couple of $1 billion to take this to the market. What's the first thing they do? They're not going to believe peer review. They're going to do that experiment again, right? And just to see whether their original experiment did work. And what do they find? Well, they find that about 80% of the time, the original work is wrong. So that promising stuff, it's not even 50% failure rate, it's 80% failure rate in that particular time. So this is the problem which we've got. We have scientists, scientific organisations which are using systems which don't have any useful quality assurance. We know that there's a problems in many large areas like the biomedical area, but then when you go to situations like the Great Barrier Reef or even, dare I say, climate change, you then have this ideological problem where some of the scientists are working ideologically. Their peers who have the same ideology are reviewing their work. You have what amounts almost to dishonesty with some of the scientific organisations, like the refusal to take some of this data again. And so you've got a much, much bigger problem in the environmental sciences than you will have in, say, the biomedical area. So we need to do something. We need some form of quality assurance. Now, I've been saying we need this Office of Science Review where a government, I know that's the problem, right? A government-funded organisation which will take some of this work and really do quality assurance. Now, I know what you're thinking. It'll just get taken over by the same people, right? The same people will take it over. If some of the funding was also, say, coming from the cane growers organisation, right, we want to check this coral growth rate because, you see, this coral growth rate curve is important because if the inshore corals are not collapsing, because we know cane farming started in the year 1920, effectively. If they're polluting the reef, the first thing that should happen is growth rate should slow down, right? Well, we don't see it. We don't see that happening. We see something happening in 1990, we better find out whether that's really true or not. So we need to do this. If the cane growers were paying for half of that cost, then they have some say in what is done. I think there are other ways in which you can try to stop the organisation being captured. a lot of scientists actually have been on the wrong side of the peer group. Maybe not in a spectacular way, but they've found they can't get their papers published because they're on the wrong side of the peer group. They eventually get what I call rehabilitate, that they are proven to be right. And they then understand the bullying that effectively goes on in peer review. And they're exactly the sort of scientists that we need on this organisation. The best example of that, and I would really like to try to approach this guy, is a guy called Barry Marshall, who's the Nobel Prize winner who discovered that stomach ulcers were caused by a bacteria. He was ridiculed when he first said that, right? When he first discovered it. All his peers said, this is a joke. We've known for 100 years that there are no bacteria in the stomach to cause ulcers. It's impossible. And he was proven to be right, and he got the Nobel Prize. He understands the peer group, right? He understands what they can do. But on the other, unlike Peter Ridd, who has not been rehabilitated, who's still somewhat, disreputable, he is beyond reproach because he has. And we need scientists like him, or even him, to be on the board of directors or whatever for that. By the way, I'm pretty sure he's a climate skeptic. He hasn't said so, but he hasn't signed the Nobel laureates, because all the Nobel laureates almost have signed a letter saying we've got to worry about climate change. He has not done that. I shouldn't put words in his mouth, but I suspect he's not. Now, I also think that we shouldn't be just worrying about science, right? We've actually got to broaden the context. Graham mentioned my dear old man. And yes, he was talking about problems in Queensland education in the 1990s. And he was right that in the 1970s, we had the best physics, maths, that's what we were interested in, my old man and I, physics and maths and chemistry. We were the best in the country. By about the year 2010, Queensland was the worst in the country. And that's on data coming from the Australian Defence Force Academy, who take students from everywhere, and they give an exam to their first year students when they come in, right? And we went from best to worst. But it's much broader, the problems in education. We have Noel Pearson, who's pushing this idea we need this system of direct instruction. We shouldn't be sending our kids to the school and then they just somehow learn all by themselves. Some of these crazy educational theories that are used. We have our educational experts who are essentially experimenting on our children, and they have been doing that for decades, and they supposedly do it on the basis of scientific research, right? We have the same problem, that we're relying on our experts and our experts aren't reliable. It doesn't matter whether it's in education or whether it's in criminology or whether it's on the Great Barrier Reef, we have the same problem. And we are setting policies on education and various other things based on this stuff, and that also needs to be checked. We need to be making sure the stuff that we're actually using is properly checked. So I'd like to actually try to broaden it. And the reason that I want to broaden it is because, you see, you guys here, you're all city slickers, all right? So for us, you're all pretty well untrustworthy people, just to start. Because most people in the city, they don't give a damn about farmers, right? They do care about the reef. Of course, we all care about the reef, but, if a cane farmer in Tully goes broke, well, who cares, right? It's 1,000 kilometres away. What you care about is what happens in your life, and that's fair enough, right? But you guys are also being damaged by some of these experts who aren't really experts, right? Who are essentially setting government policy because they're the experts and the government's going to have to do what we say, basically. In the educational arena, you guys are being affected just as much as we are up north, and therefore maybe you guys will understand it if we broaden this problem of our experts and this problem around policy science, rather than relying on topics like the Great Barrier Reef. So we really do need a major reform in science quality, not just proper science, but also the soft sciences like criminology and education. And I think I probably should leave it at that. I've already gone over time, but hopefully there'll be lots of questions.
Oh, good.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. Although when it comes to cane farmers in Tully, perhaps David Christopherli, who grew up on a cane farm in Ingham, might have some concerns. We just would hope that he would.
Yes.
So No, Peter's keen to have some questions. I think I saw you first.
Yeah, Peter, Lloyd Russell, our extended family are in beef cattle. We, across all the cattle we sell, pay in excess of $200,000 a year to MLA. Yeah, most of us are organic beef producers. Our carbon has gone up from 3% to 3 parts per million to 6.2 parts per million in 28 years. From your understanding of the model that science has got and the agricultural business model, how can humble little beef producers like us start to change that business model for research and development that costs $900 million a year?
Well, I think we need to basically mutiny. I mean, my problem with, not so much now, but up until 2 years ago, AgForce and cane growers, I hate to say this, but I think they were worse than useless, right? Worse than useless. They were actually sailing with the bad guys. Now, those both AgForce and cane growers have changed, right? And they now actually representing their members, whereas I don't think they were before. They were in bed with the government. I don't know where the MLA is.
Well, we're not members of AgForce because they're members of QFF. Sorry, NFF.
Well, NFF is a, NFF, I hope I'm not offending people, I don't care actually. NFF is a major problem.
It is.
Right. But it's like so many organisations, right? They get captured. Right? It doesn't need to matter whether they're government organisations or otherwise. They seem to get captured. All these agricultural organisations, and this sounds big-headed, need to do what I'm saying. We have to make sure the science upon which we're making the decision is sensible, because if it's not, you will be making bad decisions. But that's what they've got to do, and that's what the meat and livestock have got to do. It's what cane growers have got to do, and they are actually now pushing that.
Grains research.
Yep, same
question. Is a basket case.
Yep.
Anita.
I saw, sorry, Anita Wigan. I saw this just this morning, actually, a video where scientists in Greenland are actually, they've done a 3-kilometre core sample, and from that they've been able to ascertain the temperature at that particular time in history.
Yes.
And they have shown that, in fact, we were going down, the temperature was going down, so it disproves climate change.
Well, there's so much geological evidence that demonstrates that things have been hotter beforehand, and also that we get massive fluctuations, and that, well, all right, it's gone, the temperature may have increased by a degree maybe. Well, so what? I mean, this is what it does. I was just on a Skype call yesterday to a guy who works on the glaciers in Switzerland. And one of the things he's been looking at is they're talking about these glaciers which are receding. Well, in one place, in receding, and they're uncovering logs. Well, there's now forest under there. There hasn't been forest up there for, probably 5,000 years. So clearly it was warmer then. The tree line is now 1,000 metres below.
So my question is, has any sort of core sampling been done of the reef?
Yes.
That gives us evidence where there has been growth, times of growth, and times where there's been no growth?
Yes, there has. So you can see bleaching. The effect is when you get bleaching, the growth rings will be small. You can see that going back. You can also look at what the temperature of the water was when those rings are laid down. So they use strontium barium isotopes. That might be wrong. But anyway, whatever the isotope ratio is, and it looks like when James Cook was sailing up the coast, it was about warm then as it is now. So it then maybe cooled down and then warmed up again. Now, I think more work needs to be done on that, but there certainly is evidence from the reef that things were warmer. Yeah. The other interesting thing about the reef is that if you go back 5,000 years ago, the sea level was about 1 metre high, and it's fallen since then. And when it fell, of course, the sea level falls, it exposes the tops of the reef, the coral dies. And in fact, the dead reef flats that you see on a lot of pictures of corals, in fact, if I go back to maybe this picture here of Green Island, a lot of this stuff here would come out of the water. but it would have been a reef when the water was, that's now dead coral, but it would have been a living reef 3,000 years ago. When the sea level rise, we lost vast amounts of coral. And if sea level really does rise, as it's supposed to according to the IPCC, we'll get far more coral because there's all these areas that now come out of water that won't come out of water.
Sally.
Thank you. Mr. Great, I'm Sally Jenkins. I'm a criminal defense lawyer for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands Legal Service. I'm a monarchist, but I also share an interest in native title and land use agreements from PNG, I guess, through the Torres Strait, Thursday Island. Do you see any potential for you mentioned cane farmers, any potential for groups such as cane farmers and native title claimants to join forces? Do you see any benefit in the way native title owners are managing their land that is biologically preferable to the current research?
I don't think there's much area where they can probably help each other.
Why not?
Because they're in such different areas. Yeah. So
cannot they be corralled into the same area? I mean, you spoke about criminology. You spoke about social sciences. You spoke about neo-Pearson, and
I think it could be. I mean, I would certainly like to see the criminology side of things because I think we're doing a lot of things, even in the justice system,
correct,
even in the Aboriginal justice system. I mean, my sort of daughter-in-law, my son's partner, is works with very badly damaged children, basically in that houses for them. And I see some of the things that are being done there, and they're just crazy. They're taking these damaged children and they're not helping. They're actually making life worse than what we used to do, sending kids to orphanages, and that was bad enough. And that is an example where I'm sure that there's some sort of research going on that's informing what we should do, and it needs to be looked at. Now, there may well be things that are happening with the way we treat Aboriginal communities. I'm not sure in terms of land management, but in other areas where we're not making the best decisions because the research that we're using isn't the correct research. So there may be things in that regard that could be worked on. It's certainly an interesting question.
Don. Thank you, Peter. That was most enjoyable, and I'm sure you're converted.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's the trouble, isn't it?
Well, converted but better informed. Firstly, a comment. You mentioned climate skeptics, and in my view, that would be the highest compliment that a scientist could get, would be to be a skeptic.
Yeah.
But getting back to the beginning of your troubles, did you get any support from the actual students at the university?
Yes, actually, that got me into trouble because one of my students, a young lady called Sana, wrote to me appalled at what had happened, and I responded and said, "Oh, well, no." I actually said, "Look, JC is not that bad. All the universities are just as bad." In fact, I said to her that this was in an email. I said to her that I thought if I'd been at University of Queensland, I wouldn't have lasted half as long. Anyway, they read that email and they said that was disrespectful to the university, and that was yet another charge of serious misconduct. So, yeah, no, I got quite a bit of support. My poor third years were in tears when they marched me out of the lab. So, and also support, interestingly, from my scientific opposition. So there's a guy who's now dead, unfortunately, John Brodie. And John Brodie and I have been fighting on this, he's on the other side, for 20 years. And we'd go to a bunch of, a meeting around the cane farmers or whatever. And he'd be saying the reef is on its way out, and I'd be saying, no, it's not. And we could always talk, he was a grumpy old man like me, and we could talk about everything else except for the reef and more or less agree on everything, but we did not agree on the reef. And, vehemently did not agree on the reef. But on the ABC, he stood up and said what the university did was the wrong thing. So that was my scientific opposition. And and I have to be very thankful. You know, all right, we disagree on the reef. I can't understand why he thinks the way he does, or he did. But as a man, as a human being, and for somebody who did ultimately want to get the science right, I couldn't fault him.
Ethics.
Yeah.
Anthony Bishop, I've got a slight confession to make. George Christensen put up a resolution at the 2018 LNP convention
Yeah, for that.
and I argued against it kind of vehemently because of the capture issue.
That's
So-
right. Yes. Yeah.
So then you mentioned Barry Marshall.
Yes.
I happened to be in Istanbul. I was developing a drug for Helicobacter pylori.
Right.
And Barry and his cohort absolutely hounded a guy who was talking about probiotics, which was the next kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the issue of capture is really important. Do you want to
It's
could you talk a
crucial.
little more about that?
Yeah. So the worry is that, all right. I mean, at the moment, I've been proposing this, and I think in the Senate inquiry sort of more or less recommended, or at least the coalition did. But the worry is that, all right, who's going to do these audits of the science? Is it going to be the director of the Australian Institute of Marine Science? That would be an absolute disaster. It's got to be somebody who's outside the peer group, who's going to do a genuine independent audit. And given that every other organisation, including the agricultural organisations themselves, have been captured, how can you expect this organisation not just to be a rubber stamp? And then you're even worse off. Sure, you're not going to spend a lot of money. It's only going to be a few $1 million. We're already spending $500 million plus. So it's not a big amount, but you want it to try to do this properly. Now, my answer to that is that it is certainly the biggest worry, right? And so if you argued against it, I understand why you argued against it. But other professions have managed this. So auditing is essentially, this is what we're talking about, it's auditing. Now, I know auditors, I've spoken to auditors, and they will often laugh about auditing. But you may laugh, but can you imagine if we had no auditors at all? That none of the books were ever going to ever be checked. There would be carte blanche corruption would be happening because the corporate and bureaucratic books would never be done. So yes, auditing may not be brilliant, but it's better than nothing. It's a lot better than nothing. The legal system, God bless them, that is another system where if my barrister and the university's barrister start, having drinkies and setting this thing up, one of those is going to go to jail if they can find it out, right? And I'm sure it happens, but they seem to be able to manage this organised. I mean, I look at the legal system, which I held in contempt until I see it operating and thinking, this is what we need in science. We need the guys who are saying the reef is buggered, and then the guys who are saying no, it's not, and they're going, and then the question is then who decides who's right or wrong. But at least we've got a proper argument going there. Brett Walker, the QC for the university, he's doing his job. He's putting the argument up, and I take my hat off to him. I don't particularly like him for what his side is on, but it's not his fault, right? It's not his fault. We need something similar to that. Now, if the legal system, the accounting system can do it, you see it happening in the military where they set up red and blue team. It doesn't always work. There must be something we can do, provided we can set it up in a way and get people like Barry Marshall. If you know Barry Marshall, I'm trying to organise somebody who's very respectable to go and talk to Barry Marshall and ask him how he might. You go up to him and say, how might you solve some of the problems? And just sound him out. Because if you get somebody like him on board, then the opposition are not going to say, oh, this is just a bunch of climate deniers doing it, right? Because they can't argue with something. And then you advertise for other people. You literally advertise. We want people who have been in a minor way cancelled, but being rehabilitated. And those are the people we want. And I think it could work.
John, you had a question?
Yeah, John Newcomb. I'm interested. I worked for 10 years, many years ago, in atmospheric science research. And my experience is that everyone that works in research is trying to get towards the truth and work very diligently to get there. What I'm concerned about is the political influence that I would like you to comment about in the selection of what research is done. I'm mindful of my son who did honours, and the selection of the topics that are chosen are essentially guided by the lecturers who will be reviewing the process. Now, my reflection of that process is that it is vitally seen by the lecturers to get students to reinforce the papers, the policies, to do extra research on the areas that the lecturers are studying. And often that isn't necessarily free and unbiased.
No.
Is there a better way to reinforce the broader perspective of finding the truth instead of the particular policy line?
Yes, so what you're describing there is this system of reinforcement of a particular view, right? So, I mean, what this is not quite peer review, it's quite similar to what happens with peer review. That if you're in the peer group, well, then you're in, and then the peer group will decide what funding happens because there's peer review funding. And therefore, this idea grows, the dissenters get excluded, and you end up, and then it's more than that, that you end up with an institute where you tend to have the successful people, the ones in the peers, they then get promoted and they will then appoint similar ilk. And so your Australian Institute of Marine Science gets full of people who all think the same. And they are trying, I don't know of a single scientist that I think is actually dishonest, right? I don't know a lot that I think are wrong, and I know that they are fundamentally ideological in their approach, but they don't feel it that way. They're not being dishonest. But the system tends to generate people of the same type, right? And this happens in all sorts of human endeavour, but a peer review system almost guarantees this group forming. And this is why what I'm suggesting is trying to break the group. So, for example, Australian Research Council funding, it's just a great big peer group, right? You put your application in, your peers review it, and if you're in the peer group, you get funded. If you're not, you don't, right? And the successful people will then get onto the Australian Research Council as the funders, right? Now, we need the Australian Research Councils to say, right, we want 10% of everything that you fund to go to doing antagonistic reviews of science that's being used for policy, right? Now, the government could do that right now, right? They could do that. And that then forces the argument and it starts to break down the peer groups and the groups put forward. So that's really what I think I would say on that.
Can I take you up on something there, Peter? You say you think they're honest, but you gave us an example earlier on where they used two different data sets, presumably two different methodologies, spliced them together and said, this is what this... You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of A Michael Mann.
Yes.
And what you actually had there was a hockey stick that had the blade going down.
That's right, it is. That's a hockey stick.
And in the emails, the ClimateGate emails, the guys in on that called it Michael's nature trick. They were being dishonest. The other thing it reminds me of is Piltdown Man, where they put one skull on another skeleton, which again was scientific fraud. So I refer to him as Piltdown Man.
Yes, okay.
Rather than Michael Man. But surely that you can't regard that as being honest academic.
And certainly Michael Mann, I agree with you there. There's no doubt about it. And this curve, whatever the curve was, when you talk to these guys, they'll say, oh, no, what we did was fine. There's nothing wrong with it. What becomes... they've got a reason for why they think that still should be there. But it's not dishonest to say, oh, we've got all these other reasons, we've got other priorities rather than checking to see whether that's right. Now, are they being actually dishonest? I don't know. I mean, maybe they are. But
why won't they drill?
Well, I don't know.
Can't be that expensive.
No, it's a couple of $1 million, right? They say, oh, we're more interested in...
So can we get the senator to get the...
Yeah, they're saying there's another set of results coming out shortly.
Right.
That's what I've been told by AIMS.
That will be after the new drilling.
Yeah. So they're saying that the rings don't grow fast enough, so they want to give it a bit of time, but another line is due.
Yeah.
So I've asked the question.
Well, that would prove their case if they weren't growing.
Well, so I mean, I've got another 4 years to go, so they'd said in the next 12 months or so. So don't worry, I keep like there's a spreadsheet open on my desk every day and questions the rest of it, and that's still there. Unfortunately, like this letter of big sense, it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get a reply on it, and they go glacial movements.
So one of the things about that is we've got to make sure that when they do this work, they do it properly. They don't go back to this system of using little corals. They've got to use big corals. But yeah, they come up with all sorts of excuses. But I know the director of AIMS. He hates me. He really hates me. He always ran over my foot, actually. It was interesting. I won't tell the story, but he's a very passionate fellow. He's an environmentalist. His wife, I believe, ran for the Greens in Thurngau. He doesn't believe that he's doing anything dishonest. He really doesn't. And so I don't necessarily question their motivation. I question their ideology. But when you've got ideological people like that, that's why you really do need the better quality assurance systems to make sure that they go off on a tangent.
Great. Sorry, I saw.
Frank Hills here. I'm a registered company auditor. I dispute that military comparison. The auditors go into the battlefield after the battle and bayonet the word. I don't think so. But you did touch on the legal system. I wonder if you'd give us an update and for and against each case. And you mentioned how the system and two sides and the judge. But the problem is that you wonder that everything should just go to high court, because it goes sometimes back and forth, often in cases. So where's your...
Yeah, well, for science or for the legal?
Oh, no, for your personal case.
Oh, my personal
one,
case.
lost one.
Well, but I'm looking at a system there that actually I might lose, but the system has gone through and done what it should do, and I'll accept it. I mean, if I lose, basically it just means that the university was able to write a contract, a binding contract, which means they can silence academics, right? Well, that's just, but all they've done is proven that they have got a legal contract there. Now, they should be ashamed that they've written that. That's a different story. I'll always be right, right. I'm on the side of the right. Just a question of whether what is right is also legal. Right? So that's essentially what we're arguing about, is what they did legal. But there is a system that's happening there where I am guaranteed, my guys are guaranteed to be able to talk, the judge will listen. Whereas in science, the dissenters are excluded. They are defunded, and sometimes worse than that will happen, right? And so our scientific system is like the legal system in China. That's the situation that they say.
Grant, in your case, sorry, supplementary question.
No, I think we've only got about 5 minutes to go, so perhaps if you take it up with Peter afterwards. Michael, I think I saw Wayne Black, I've got Lindsay Phillips, and then I've got you, and then depending how we go, I might finish it off.
Water, Friedrich. Wayne Black. Comment was made, you're preaching to the converted. How do we preach to the non-converted? I was up in Hamilton Island a couple of years ago. There was an American tourist on board this boat. We're going to Whitehaven Beach, stunning place. And he's telling us how he'd just been to Melbourne, and people are saying, why are you going to the Great Barrier Reef? It's dead.
Yep.
And this is what people in Melbourne are telling foreign tourists.
It's what my cousin tells me in England.
Right.
In Essex, right? And my wife was in the US, and she was again and again, when they found out that she was from Australia and from North Queensland, the immediate response is, oh, the reef is dead, isn't it? So we have told the whole world that this incredibly wonderful thing, which you just need to go and see it, to see that it's fine, right? So it beggars belief that we've managed to do that. This is our scientific institutions that have done this, that have been paid large amounts of money, and they have managed to convince the world that this wonderful ecosystem is dead. So I don't know how we go about it. The young people don't read books, so this is going to have to be made into a whole thing, and we're going to have to do videos and all the rest of it. But if you could start to challenge these scientists So some of the wheels start to fall off. The young people will start looking at these things. And that's why I think we need to broaden it to non-scientific things.
Well, I know you don't have time for another question.
Yeah, no,
but
he doesn't.
I keep getting not 90.
Come on, Wayne. Let's see.
President, just my name's Lindsay Phillips. Two incredibly brief questions. I want your background in
No, one incredibly brief
on
question.
Bob Carter, how the university treated him, and the $440 million crap deal that Turnbull did with the Reef.
Well, they treated Bob really badly, and of course I'm one of Bob's more as an acolyte. So I joined the Marine Geophysics Laboratory right at the very beginning, and Bob Carter started it with my boss Mel Herring. So I know Bob well. The $440 million, I'm actually not quite sure why people get so upset about that. Right? The government had to give that money out. It was blood money, right? So the whole world reckons that the Great Barrier Reef is dying, so they just give some money. And they don't really care how it gets spent, so they gave it to this Great Barrier Reef Foundation. And they will waste it just as well as the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the Great Barrier Reef. It doesn't matter. You might get 10% of that as value for money. But basically, governments are blackmailed by the institutions because, I'm an expert. I'm telling you that the reef is buggered. You've got to do this, otherwise we will squeal. Right?
And
So
get up and extinction.
that's right. So it doesn't matter whether it's Malcolm Turnbull or Anastasia Palaszczuk. They have to do these things because they're being forced to it by our experts. And our experts are, they are such huge problems in our society today because they're not necessarily right. In many cases, they're just plain wrong and ideologically involved.
Mike Evans, last question.
Thank you. I'm not actually North Queenslander.
Good on you.
I'm a Mackay boy, so I know a lot
That's not normal. That's
I know a lot about the reef. But in a recent article called Peter Ridd, it's Reef Science is Rotten, Not the Great Barrier.
Yes.
I'll just read the first paragraph. I want to make a comment. You say here, the International Union for Conservation of Nature has released its latest report on the state of the Great Barrier Reef. It has turned up the volume by one notch, claiming the threat to the reef has gone from significant concern to critical. It blames climate change, agriculture pollution, coastal development, industry, mining, shipping, overfishing, blah, 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 and you name it. It has cleaned the reef. But the report is just a rehash of old, mostly wrong or misleading information. So I ask the question, what is the status of the International Union for Conservation?
Well, it's one of these, it's a peer group, right? It's been set up. It's essentially, it sits sort of underneath the United Nations, but it's basically a whole group of organisations that have got together to make a much bigger noise, right? This is the way society works. A whole group of people get together and they can lobby, and that's all the IUCN is. It doesn't do any of the science itself. It will take what comes out of the Australian Institute of Marine Science or whatever else. And periodically, once every 2 years, they issue a report card on the state of the reef. They will do that every time.
Okay, well, if you've got questions that you haven't had a chance to answer, Peter will be over here selling his book. So I'm sure if you buy a book, you'll be happy to answer the question. It's not blackmail. It's a sort of consequential result. Before calling on Bob Tucker to move vote of thanks, I was remiss because I did this run sheet and Senator Jerry Rennick booked late this afternoon, so I didn't realise he was going to be here. Should have acknowledged him.
It's been Peter said before that we're hijacked by scientists and the experts and we're told what to do. I actually disagree with that. We've got an obligation to stand up to the bureaucrats in question. Yeah. My role as a senator is to put the blowtorch to them in estimates. And we should, like Mel, I've been a senator for almost 2 years now, and I'm shocked at the complicity, or not so much the complicity, but the docileness of politicians in just bobbling their head when the bureaucrats and the experts jump. And we've got to push back more. Unfortunately, you know, we've lost Craig. I mean, he's been, you know, it's the same in politics. What happens in science is that, you know, those who dissent get pushed out. Craig's been pushed out. You know, we've lost George recently. I mean, he's done it out of abuse. It's dropped to him.
Barnaby.
But well, yeah, Barnaby's pushed it up. So anyway,
The other person I'd like to mention is Andrew Cooper. Andrew runs a rival operation called Liberty Works. But you know, we're free enterprise, so we don't mind that. But he's also like us, litigious. So he's in the High Court himself later this year. Now that's because of the Official Secrets Act, something called foreign influence, isn't it? You're an agent of foreign influence because he brought some Republicans over from the US to speak at a conference here, and they demanded all sorts of things from him. I think he also had Tony Abbott. I'm not sure whether Tony Abbott's an agent of influence these days, seeing he's working for the trade organisation. Right. And Andrew's also in the Supreme Court, was it? Federal Court, arguing about our national borders and whether they would be open or not. So just like to acknowledge a fellow legal student.
Thanks very much for the items. Thank you all for coming. I couldn't help it. I think while I was listening to you the other night, I've always held the view that one of the problems with science and all the sort of research stuff generally is the methodology of funding. That's the grant-based funding. And we get this sort of competition for money. And listening to you, I was thinking about when I was a 17-year-old, I enrolled at the University of Queensland as Faculty of Science, and turned up and did a whole range of subjects. And my zoology lecturer was Dr. Robert Endean. And Bob Endean was part showman, part science. And his big thing was the Great Barrier Reef. And if we didn't deal with the crown of thorns starfish, the whole reef would be devastated and gone in 10 years. And he lived off that for decades, promoting that message. Government funding was coming his way all the time. Courier Mail front page headlines were a regular feature. Public funding efforts were going on. And I was one of his students and learned a lot just watching this guy in action, I can tell you. But I think he was one of the very early players.
He's the first.
Yeah, he was the first. Right.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah.
Well, I was one of his boys. I was a 17-year-old dragging around various reefs and things. So that's a big part of the problem, in my view. So, but thanks for everything tonight, Peter. Thanks for everything you're doing. You're showing enormous patience, persistence, and determination with this issue. And I think everybody realises that you've got a really bum rap the way you're treated up there, especially by the Vice Chancellor of James Cook University. And a number of us have had dealings with that Vice Chancellor before she was the Vice Chancellor. When she used to work in a place just over the river there, was a humble junior lecturer in marketing. And she's got a fancy name for that these days. I can't remember what it is, but psychological something. Is that right?
Organisational psychology.
Organisational psychology. Right? Used to be marketing. Marketing with a fancy name for salesmanship. But anyway, that's a number of us have dealt with it. And I was on a board with her for a number of years before she went to Townsville. And so she's one tricky little lady. Yes. So thanks very much for everybody for coming. Thanks, Peter, for coming down from Townsville for the night and helping us out. And thanks also to Peter Sherwood, who organised things for us. And I'm sure there's more questions to be asked and more books to be sold. So thank you very much.
Oh, great, thanks very much. Let's stand right. You know, let's get the spot, turn around.